United States, 1955. A man named Louis Marx was the most powerful toy manufacturer on the planet. His company, Louis Marx and Company, was generating over $100 million in annual revenue at a time when that number was almost incomprehensible for a single industry player. But the money was never the most interesting thing about him. What Louis Marx had just figured out is something that no competitor had come close to understanding, would go on to quietly reshape the way an entire generation of parents thought about love. And once you hear it, you will not be able to walk through a toy store the same way ever again. Time magazine had already crowned him the Toy King. He had manufacturing plants on 4 continents, distribution deals with every major retailer in America, and a product catalogue that ran hundreds of pages deep. By every measure that existed, Louis Marx had won the toy industry, but what made him different from every competitor who came before him was not his factories. It was not his distribution. It was not even his products. It was what he understood about parents, something very concerning that will make you question every decision you ever made when choosing a toy for your kids. Louis Marx understood that a parent standing in the store was not thinking about the toy. They were thinking about themselves, about whether they were doing enough, about whether their child would look back one day and feel loved, about whether the family across the street, the one with the bigger house and the louder Christmas morning, was somehow giving their children something that his customer was not. He was not selling toys, he was selling relief. The toy was just the object. The feeling was the product. And once that distinction was clear, the entire machinery of modern toy marketing was built on top of it. That is where this story begins, not with a child, with a parent who was made to feel like they were never quite doing enough. Before we go any further, we need to establish what child development researchers have actually known for a very long time. A toddler, between the ages of 1 and 3, is in one of the most critical windows of brain development that will ever exist in their entire life. More neural connections are being formed in this period than at any other point in human development. The architecture of how they think, how they regulate emotion, how they relate to other people, how they tolerate frustration, how they persist through difficulty, all of it is being laid down in real time. And the primary mechanism through which all of this development happens is not a toy. It is play, but not the kind of play the toy industry would have you picture. And the difference between the two is so significant that researchers have spent careers trying to get parents to understand it. Most never do, because no one is paying billions of dollars to make sure they do. It is unstructured, open-ended, self-directed play. It is a child picking up a rock and wondering what happens if they put it here. It is a child talking to an imaginary person for 45 minutes and building an entire social world out of nothing. It is a child sitting with nothing to do and, in the discomfort of that nothingness, beginning to generate something from the inside. This is what developmental psychologists call intrinsic motivation, and it is one of the most important capacities a human being can develop in early childhood, the ability to generate engagement from within rather than waiting for the environment to deliver it. But there is a big problem somewhere. A toy, by definition, delivers engagement from the outside. It is pre-packaged stimulation. Someone else decided what it would do, what it would sound like, what it would respond to, what it would teach. The child receives it, the child does not generate it, and the more sophisticated the toy, the more complete that delivery is, and the less the child has to bring. The industry could not sell what toddlers actually needed, it could not bottle unstructured time, it could not market parental presence, it could not put a price on a Tuesday afternoon when nothing is scheduled and a child's allowed to be bored, until their own imagination rescues them. So it built something it could sell. And then it built a story to make that thing feel necessary, a story so well constructed that it stopped feeling like a story at all. It started feeling like common sense, like love, like what every decent parent simply does. The shift did not happen overnight, it was gradual, deliberate, and extraordinarily well funded. In the 1950s and early 1960s, toy advertising was largely straightforward. Here is the toy, here is what it does, here is how much it costs. Children were the audience, the pitch was simple, this is fun. Ask your parents. But in the late 1960s and into the 1970s, something changed in the way consumer research was being conducted across multiple industries. Marketers were beginning to understand something very, very underrated, the psychology of the purchasing decision, in ways that had not been mapped before. And what the research kept returning to was this. Guilt was a more powerful motivator than aspiration, And what they did with that finding is one of the most calculated moves in the history of consumer marketing. Stay with this. Aspiration made a consumer think about the future. It created consideration. It generated hesitation. Guilt made a consumer act right now. It bypassed deliberation entirely. It went straight to the emotional core of a person's self-image and applied pressure at the most vulnerable point. For parents, that point was obvious. Am I doing enough for my child? That question lives in almost every parent. It does not matter how present you are, how intentional, how loving. The question finds its way in through exhaustion and comparison, and the ordinary guilt of being a human being trying to raise another one. The toy industry found that question, and it answered it with something that had nothing to do with your child's development and everything to do with your feeling of relief in the moment you swiped your card. By the mid-1970s, the language of toy advertising had shifted almost entirely. Toys were no longer just fun, they were developmental, they were educational. They were investments in your child's future. The imagery changed too. Advertisements stopped centering the toy and started centering the parent watching the child use the toy. That parent's face was always the same, relaxed, relieved, certain. The unspoken message was precise. A good parent provides this. A loving parent does not let their child go without. Can you notice it too? What they were actually selling was not the toy. It was something way beyond that. By the time the 1980s arrived, that message had embedded itself so deeply into the culture of parenting that it no longer needed to be advertised. Parents were delivering it to each other, at birthday parties, at school gates, in living rooms where the volume of toys present had become a visible signal of how much a family cared. The average American child, by the mid-1980s, was receiving more than 70 new toys per year. Not because children had changed, not because research had found that 70 toys produce better developmental outcomes than 4, but because the story had become the culture, and the culture had become the standard, and no parent wanted to fall below the standard when their child's well-being was the stakes. In 2018, researchers at the University of Toledo conducted a study that was quiet in its publication, but significant in its findings. They recruited toddlers and placed them in 2 different play environments. The first environment contained 16 toys, the second contained 4. Both sets of toys were comparable in type and quality. The researchers then observed how the children played in each environment and measured the quality and duration of their engagement. The results contradicted almost everything the toy industry had spent decades implying. Children in the 4-toy environment played with each toy for significantly longer periods. They invented more uses for each object, they demonstrated higher levels of creativity and more sophisticated problem solving. Their attention was sustained, their frustration tolerance was noticeably higher. Children in the 16-toy environment moved faster, they sampled more. They put one thing down after a few minutes and picked up another. On a surface level, they appeared engaged. But what the researchers were measuring told a different story. The children were stimulated, but they were not deeply engaged. And there is a difference between those 2 states that matters enormously for development. Stimulation is the nervous system receiving input. Engagement is the mind actively working. A child watching lights flash on a toy is stimulated. A child trying to figure out how to make 2 blocks balance on top of each other without them falling is engaged. The first experience passes through the child, the second experience builds the child. This study was not the first to reach conclusions in this direction. Research going back decades had been pointing at the same truth from different angles. Jerome Bruner, one of the most influential cognitive psychologists of the 20th century, wrote extensively in the 1970s about the relationship between play and cognitive development, arguing that the conditions that produce the richest development are conditions of low structure and high autonomy. Lev Vygotsky, whose work on child development remains foundational in the field, identified play as the primary vehicle through which children develop self-regulation and abstract thinking. None of this research pointed toward more toys. None of it suggested that complexity and quantity of play materials were associated with better outcomes, but none of it was going to be printed on a toy box either. This is the part of the conversation that gets uncomfortable, because we are not talking about a minor inconvenience. We are talking about developmental consequences that researchers have been documenting for decades and that parents have rarely been told about in plain language. When a toy does the work, the child does not. When a button produces a sound, the child never discovers what their own voice can create. When a toy responds automatically to every touch, the child never sits in the silence of nothing happening and has to ask why, and then has to try something different, and then has to try something different again. When every function of an object is predetermined by the engineer who designed it, the child never gets to be the engineer. Dr. Stuart Brown, a psychiatrist who spent decades researching the science of play and founded the National Institute for Play, made an observation that has stayed with researchers across multiple disciplines. What he found was not just surprising, it was the kind of finding that should have changed how every pediatrician spoke to every parent in every well-child visit. But it did not, because the people who needed parents not to hear it had bigger budgets than the people who needed them to. He found that play-deprived children did not simply miss out on enjoyment, they missed out on the foundational process through which the brain learns to regulate itself. Self-regulation is the capacity to manage emotions, frustrations, to delay gratification, and to persist when something is difficult. These are not qualities that appear automatically with age. They are built, and they are built primarily through the experience of unstructured play, where the child encounters small problems and is left to work through them, without rescue. A child who has always had the next thing handed to them has not had the experience of generating their own next thing, and that experience, repeated across thousands of small moments in the first 3 years of life, is precisely how executive function is built. The irony is almost too clean. Parents were buying more and more in the name of giving their children an advantage, and the research suggests they may have been purchasing the opposite. It is important to say this clearly and without ambiguity. Every parent who has ever stood in a toy aisle and felt the pull of that purchase was responding to a pressure that was engineered. They were inside a story that had been told to them so many times, from so many directions, by so many cultural voices, that it no longer felt like a story. It felt like obvious truth. Of course you buy your child things. Of course more is better. Of course a loving home is a full one. But most parents have also had the other experience, the one that does not make it into the advertisements. The child tears open the gift, holds it for 3 minutes, puts it down, and goes back to playing with the wrapping paper or the box or the pile of cushions they pulled off the couch 20 minutes before the gift arrived. That moment is not ingratitude. That moment is not a failure of the gift or the parent who gave it. That moment is a child telling you exactly what the research has been trying to say for 50 years. I did not need that. I was already doing something real. What toddlers carry forward from early childhood is not an inventory of objects. The research on early memory and attachment is consistent on this point. What encodes, what becomes the emotional baseline of a felt safe childhood is not things. It is attunement. It is the experience of being seen. It is the memory stored in the body before language exists, of a face that was genuinely glad to look at them. You cannot manufacture that in a factory. You cannot ship it in a box. You cannot put it on a shelf and mark it down for the holidays. But for decades, parents were handed something that looked close enough to it that they reached for it anyway. And what happened to the children who grew up in homes where that substitution was made over and over again? That is a conversation the industry has never once been interested in having. Louis Marks stepped back from his company in 1975. By then, the industry he helped build had outgrown him. Larger corporations with more sophisticated research arms and bigger advertising budgets had taken what he understood about parental guilt and scaled it into something global. The toy market kept growing. The average toy count per household kept rising. The language of educational development became so standard that it appeared on almost every product, regardless of what the product actually did. Today, the global toy market is valued at over $100 billion annually. It continues to grow every year. And somewhere right now, in a store somewhere, a tired parent who has been working too many hours and feeling too guilty about it for too long is standing in front of something bright and asking themselves a question they did not come up with on their own. Is this enough? Am I enough? Will this make up for the time I did not have? The answer to all three questions is the same, and it has nothing to do with the toy. What your toddler's brain needs in these years is not novelty, it is not stimulation, it is not a product designed to accelerate a milestone on a chart. It is time that belongs to no agenda. It is a problem small enough for their hands that no one solves for them. It is the floor, and some space, and the knowledge that you are nearby and that they are safe to be bored until they are not anymore. That is where executive function comes from. That is where self-regulation is built. That is where the capacity to persist and create and tolerate discomfort is formed. Child psychologists call it unstructured play. Children do not call it anything, they just call it being home, being small, being in the same room as someone who loves them and is not trying to make them into anything yet. They remember it long after they have forgotten every toy they ever owned, and so do you.